All right, live from the recording studios in St. Paul, it's AP Art History with the 80s, 90s, and aughts. I guess I'm not doing 70s. A little bit of 70s. All right, so we're going to start with the Harry Who. A very interesting group out of the Art Institute of Chicago in the 1960s. I just kind of looked up their definition. Bright, bold graphic work. I always just think of Jim Nutt, who you're seeing here with Why Did He Do It, 1967. Jim Nutt is kind of distinct. I mean, he's just got this really strange way of presenting the figure, and it's just a really interesting group of artists. There's about four of them, and they become more well known. There was a Harry Who show recently in the last 4 years. Just wanted you to be a little bit aware of them. And then I'll give you one more from Jim Nutt. Yeah, and here I think you can see the influence of comic books, and just had a very unique and unusual way of presenting the human figure, as I said before. Okay, so that's just a little preamble. I guess that was the 60s. And then I wanted to jump into Cindy Sherman. And she, I'm going to say was, not is, my favorite living artist. I've kind of now more headed towards Carrie James Marshall, who is an African-American artist. I'll say she's in my top three. I always used to say that she was my fave, but I've kind of moved away from her a little bit. Nothing, I mean, it's not to take anything away from her. Okay, so this is a very interesting story. So she was in an, I don't know if she was, well, she was doing art in Buffalo, New York. And this is quite shocking. She flunked her first photography class. And then she decided to, when she was in another film or another photography class, she decided to create what she called the film still series. And it's always her in the photographs. And they look like they are from film noir, exact film noir scenes, but they're not. And lo and behold, this made Cindy Sherman famous at the age of 20. I'm doing the math here. Hold on. Yeah, 24. Remember, I said sometimes you make your best work in your 20s, and then you're forever measured up against it. And that's certainly Cindy Sherman's story. Although I think she's doing some interesting things now. Now, what she perfects is what's called a posed photography technique. And we're just throwing out the door any discussion of the whole idea of whether or not photography has to be unposed and on the fly and so on and so forth. She develops this type of photography, and it influences a number of artists after her. And she is a chameleon for sure. This is what's interesting about her. She never has any studio assistants. If you look on Art21, she shows you her studio. She's got all kinds of drawers full of fake noses and such. And she just really kind of does it on her own. And so that's another one from the Film Still series. And then this is probably the most famous one. A lot of people think it's a recreation of Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, but it's not. And I think that her dad was the one that was actually doing the, pushing the button on the actual camera. This is one of my favorites too. Sorry, that was a little hiccup. I had to have somebody close the door. I'm upstairs. Yeah, so this is another one. And then, oops, sorry. Let me change it. Okay. Then she went with color. and it's kind of a similar sort of theme. It's haunting, a little bit disturbing with this one. And So that was sort of her first entry into color. And then she went to Italy and became really fascinated by the old masters. And on the right is Botticelli's The Return of Judith to Bethulia. I think we've talked about that story where Judith cuts off the head of the Assyrian general Holofernes and saves her city. And then on the left, you've got Cindy Sherman's take on it. Not the greatest photograph there, sorry guys. So instead of his head, it's a mask, and she's dressed up as Judith. I think Judith, it has to be the one with Botticelli. And then this is my favorite of hers, of her Italian Renaissance recreations. So instead of Judith, it's her maidservant that Cindy Sherman is dressed up as on the left, and on the right is Mantegna's take on the story as well. And then let's go do a couple more Cindy Shermans. This is from 1990. And yes, those are plastic breasts, and I believe it's a plastic stomach. It's all sort of a fake facade to her front. Yeah, so I don't know. I've always kind of liked this one. And then last but not least, this is kind of what she's been doing. Well, not really. I mean, we're in 2020 now, and this is from 2008. But what's interesting about this one is it is definitely a satirical look at really rich women who are the only ones that can really afford a Cindy Sherman photograph. So it's interesting to think about, who among the rich elite would buy this if it is indeed a critique of them in their homes if they own it. It's kind of an interesting little discussion there, in my mind at least. She's still working. She has gone to digital, but very late, adopted digital very late. And yes, she used to have somebody develop her film, and if it wasn't right, she went back to the drawing board again and got dressed up in whatever she was for the day, and would take pictures and then take them back to the developer. And so now you would hope that with digital that her process is a little bit faster. Okay, so there's Cindy Sherman, one of my favorite artists of all time. Her boyfriend in Buffalo, when they were both studying art, was Robert Longo. And he's famous for his drawings of men, mostly men. I don't know if I've ever even seen one of women, out on the street, in a very twisted poses. And he and Robert Longo and Cindy Sherman are considered to be part of what's called the Pictures Generation, which was a group of artists. And I'm always a little foggy on what they represented or what they were all about, but I guess if you want to look them up, the Picture Generation. Okay, and then we're going to go to text. Artist who in the 70s and on upwards, I guess we are talking about the 70s, used text in their works. And probably the most famous, I would say, today, that many of you probably are familiar with, is Jenny Holzer. And she created what are called truisms in the late 70s. So there they are. Now, if you're a person that has lived in the Twin Cities since you're a little baby, you may remember that some of these truisms were put on stone benches in the Walker Sculpture Garden. I think they're gone now. But that was always kind of a little bit of fun to sit on one of the truisms. And then, sorry, what am I doing? Sorry about that. And then this is sort of a little bit of a newer one. This is 2007, because we're only going to talk about the early aughts here, so I'm not going to, I will maybe go up to the 2020. You Are My Own. Now, Holzer is not continuing to actually make her own text. One of the things that she's done lately is taken released documents from the Iraq War in the early aughts and used those in her work. But the stuff I used to really love was her own sort of poetry in a sense that would oftentimes be on billboards in New York City and Times Square. But she's kind of moved away from that. Okay, now we're going to look at Barbara Kruger. And definitely within her work, you're going to see some feminism themes. And this one is You Will No Longer Be Seen and Not Be Heard, 1985. And of course, she's talking about women. And what she does is she appropriates black and white photos, more or less from like the 1950s, and then puts text to them. That's what she's known for more than anything else. And then I think this is one of my faves. Obviously, a very strong feminist statement here. Your body is a battleground. Yeah, so she is. If you see feminist books or newspapers, sometimes you'll see Barbara Kruger image in it. And then a little bit of a critique of capitalism. I shop, therefore I am. And then this one is probably one of the more disturbing ones. When I hear the word culture, I take out my checkbook. Kruger is still working today. She's part of UCLA's graduate program in their MFA program, and UCLA is seen as the strongest graduate program in the United States for art, and she's part of it. I'm trying to think of it. Well, I'll get back to it, but there's a couple other, very notable artists that teach in that program. Larry Pittman, who we might see today. And then, okay. So let's keep going. And then when we talk about installation or conceptual art, and I think we talked about this in class, we definitely need to talk about David Hammons. And actually, I'm going to create a homework assignment for you guys in the next couple weeks. He famously made these blizzard balls of snow and sold them on the streets of New York City. And that is one of his most famous pieces. And we'll learn more about him later on in the class. Okay, Robert Gober here is playing a little bit with Duchamp, and this is called The Subconscious Sink. It's actually in the Walker's collection. And then this is probably one of my favorite installations of all time, probably because of my Catholic upbringing, but there's a pipe through a Virgin Mary statue, and then down below you hear running water, although there is no water, and there's this very delicately created plastic natural whirl below that grate, and then there's something in the suitcases, but I can't remember what it is. Now, here's an interesting question. What do you do with this if you've bought it, this installation? I mean, and what is happening, and you can make a critique about this, and I certainly would be one to do it, but a lot of contemporary art collectors are creating their own museums or small galleries off the side of their houses or houses on their estate to show this installation art. You might want to think about that when you get really rich. Like, what are you going to do when you collect installation art? Okay, and then last but not least, this is also at the Walker, and there's a question as to whether or not he developed the floral design on the tissue box. But here is another. This is very Duchampian. He didn't create the child's seat, nor did he probably produce the drain. So this is essentially kind of a ready-made from 1997 by Gober. All right, now we're looking at talking about whoa, we're switching up here. It gives me a little bit of whiplash. Here is Philip Pearlstein, and I would say that he is one of the most famous he's still alive. Uh, One of the most famous, somewhat photorealistic painters of the human form. And interestingly enough, he roomed with Andy Warhol when Warhol first moved to New York City. Talk about two very different artists. I would have liked to have listened in to some of their conversations. And then probably the most well known to most people's figurative artists uh, would be Lucian Freud. And yes, I think we talked about before, he was the grandson of Sigmund Freud. And this is Girl with White Dog. And then this is part of his family. I was gonna have a homework assignment on his most famous wife. She's to the far left. She's a painter in her own right, but I don't know. It just got kind of a little weird. Lucian Freud had a lot of mistresses, a lot of wives, and had children by many of them, and he lived a very bohemian lifestyle, let's just say that. And this is a look more at kind of what he's known for. Although, do I have a no, darn, sorry. Known for his nudes as well. He had a particularly one model, a male, rather large man that he painted a lot of times. Um, and yeah, so if you're looking for somebody that is well known and very, very highly regarded in the world of figurative painting, definitely head towards Lucian Freud. All right, and then now we're looking at a work by Susan Rothenberg, and she did a series on horses for about 10 years. And she admits in an Art 21 video that she never really liked horses, which I always found kind of odd. Why would you then paint them constantly for 10 years? And if you look her up on Art 21, her studio is really interesting. It's just a total mess, and she loves to keep brushes for years and just constantly dips them together in different works. It's just a very dirty kind of palette that you see with her work, and she's still alive and kicking. And now we're going to move to the 1980s, for better or worse, and we're going to look at a group of painters. Oh, there's, I forgot I put this in here. Here's, now, for some of you who keep your brushes pristine, I'm sure this is just making you sick, but yeah, that's Susan Rothenberg's table with all of her brushes and paint. Okay, so we need to look at these guys called the American Neo-Expressionists. And the first one is Julian Schnabel, and what he's known for is he breaks crockery and then glues it onto his paintings. Now, the late 80s was the time of the yuppies and BMWs, and people were just getting very, very rich, and they were the baby boomers who were being hypocrites because they were, oh, Jennifer's not a baby boomer, but she's anyway. So the baby boomers went from peace, love, and understanding to materialism in the 1980s. And Schnabel was one of these artists that was highly regarded and sought after. He later went on to become a film director. He did a very interesting biopic of Basquiat. Yeah, so he kind of went heavily into filmmaking. This is David Solly. He's known for his diptychs. I'm not showing you a very disturbing one, but just trust me. If you want to Google, there's other ones that are much more disturbing. He's now a little bit more of an art critic than he is actually a painter, which is interesting to me. And then the bad boy of the 80s is, and that's the title of this painting actually, but is Eric Fischl, who is definitely mellowed out. Now he hobnobs with the rich and famous and paints them. Yeah, this one got him into trouble. And then this one, of course, is very different. This is 16 years later, God and Dog House. I think as far as just the pure facility, his abilities of all the painters of the 80s, I think he was the most talented. And is still working. And then up to 2017, this is She and Her, and somewhat similar to some of the things that he does. The bourgeoisie out, enjoying themselves in a leisurely way. And he usually has some sort of tension, some sort of disturbing elements to his paintings, but nothing like what he was doing in the 80s. Okay, a big fan favorite, it has always been Elizabeth Murray. And what's interesting about her for me is she was getting a lot of attention in the 80s and then kind of went off the map in the 90s and then came back really strong on the art market in the early or in the 90s slash early aughts. She died tragically of cancer. And it would have been really great to see what she would have continued to do. One of the things that she's known for, of course, is that her canvases are not stretched just on in a rectangular or square way. She makes these very interesting, and assistants in her studio do, very interesting shapes to her canvas, and therefore the canvas becomes sculptural. And that's that. And then here's a later one, obviously influenced by cartoons, and just sort of fun, embraceable, and wonderful. Okay, one of the big things that happened, of course, in the 1980s is that artists would start on the street doing graffiti and then become embraced, and put into shows in the galleries. And Basquiat, of course, well, Keith Haring's pretty darn famous as well, but okay, either Basquiat or Haring. Well, I'd say Basquiat now. Basquiat, of course, was one of the most famous of those individuals. Unfortunately, fame did not do well for him. He died of a heroin overdose, and people are still just so fascinated by him. I'm not kidding. There's been at least 2 to 3 documentaries about him in the last 5 to 6 years. And his prices have just skyrocketed on the art market. This is called Grillo 1984. There's some motifs that you'll see in a lot of his works, the crown, and he always puts in there SOS, same old shit. Sorry to say shit, but I had to. And there's a lot of just very interesting symbolism in his works. And then the other street artist, of course, of note would be Keith Haring, who tragically died of AIDS. There has been some shows as of late over the last couple of years with all the different artists who died of AIDS in the late 80s. And it's just, when I looked at the list, actually it was a lot of photos of all the various different dancers and actors and that died of AIDS. It's just incredibly tragic. So here's Keith in one of his gallery shows. And then what he's known for is sort of this radiation of light that comes off of his figures. I guess this is a group of Christians seeing Jesus on TV here. And then this one I had not ever really seen before until a couple years ago. I really like it. He's also known for his babies that radiate. We actually had a children's book of Keith Haring's works. And he had these stores called pop shops. I don't think any of them are still around, but they sold his art. He was worldwide known. and beloved, and a sad, sad, tragic end to his life. Oh, there's one of the radiating babies. There it is. Yay. It's kind of similar to the cover of the book we have. Okay, now we're going to go to Kenny Scharf, who has had a show just recently at the New Museum. And this is Fred and Wilma in Heaven. There's a Kenny Scharf poster in my classroom, guys. Maybe you've seen it. It's to the right of the slide screen. And that's also the Jetsons. And who didn't love the Jetsons? I certainly did in my childhood. And then this is a mural in Miami. I think I told you guys this story before. I was at a workshop, teacher workshop in Miami in the summer of 2015, and I met a guy whose last name was Picasso, and he was actually related to the Pablo Picasso. And he took me through this area. He was so nice. He took me through, I got in his old truck, and before I got to I had like this 5-hour layover, and he goes, "Hey, I'll take you down to this graffiti area in Miami." And the name of it is escaping me. And lo and behold, I see this Kenny Scharf mural, and you name it, all the major mural and graffiti artists are represented in this neighborhood in Miami. Don't go in the summer. It's unbearably hot. Okay, so there's Kenny Scharf. And then this is a group who I don't know all that much about. They're from Providence, Rhode Island. And they were an art collective, and I've always been fascinated by art collectives. And they call themselves Force Field. And here's one of their more famous, I guess, knitted performance art pieces. And then here they are again. I just love this stuff. I don't know why, I just do. And this is called Third Annual Rogaboga 2002. They ended their art collectives in 2003, quite sadly. All right, now we're moving into Joseph Beuys, and we're actually moving into the Germans, some of who we've talked about before. And so when we talk about Gerhard Richter and Sigmar Polk, they were influenced by Joseph Beuys. And one of his most famous works was a performance art piece in which he wrapped himself in textiles, and then a wild coyote. I actually heard some coyotes this morning, guys, down by the river road. And I always hear them at my father-in-law's house in the hills near San Diego. It's quite haunting if you've ever heard them yipping. Anyways, wild coyote attacking Joseph Beuys' textiles and unwrapping him. He was not hurt in the process. Don't worry. The other thing that he's famous for is he's got this tinfoil all over him, and then he's holding a dead rabbit. I decided not to put that in the slide tray because I know you guys are, animal rights activists and such. So yeah, Joseph Beuys influences all these other guys I'm going to talk about. And one of them is Sigmar Polk, who I guess he didn't really recently die, 2010. This work is at the Walker, and it is huge. And it's called Mrs. Autumn and Her Two Daughters. He appropriates images, much like Dada artists, sort of, from the 19th century. And then puts them into his paintings is the best way to kind of describe it. And then this is a little bit later. No, actually, these are kind of the same kind of years, 91, 92. This one is at the National Gallery. And again, an appropriated image on the right with some of his world shown with some of kind of an abstract application here of paint. All right, many people believe that Gerhard Richter, and we've talked about him in class before, is the most important artist living. His show was in New York City, and unfortunately, of course, they shut it because of COVID-19. And this is a painting. It is not a photograph. So you get a sense of how talented he is as far as being able to render things in detail to fool your eye. And then this is another painting of his, and they're just quite something to behold. And then, okay, get ready for a whiplash again. Here is what he does now, or, well, this is 1990s, but this is kind of one of the things that he's known for, where he puts paint down onto the canvas and uses a squeegee and goes across the canvas with the squeegee and makes these abstract works. Yeah, so quite a bit of a change. Gerhard Richter's show in New York, probably the last time he will show, because he is in his, I think, 90s. Yeah. Okay, let's keep going. Then here's Amsel Kiefer, who you guys all know from the homework assignment. So you know enough about him. We don't have to go over it again. Very thick application of paint onto the canvas, even so much so that it's inches off the canvas if you look at it from the side. Landscape's a big thing with him, of course, and then also some text, as you can see in the background there. And then this one is just crazy. I mean, again, just it's sculptural in the middle. The paint is so thick. Mass MoCA, a very famous contemporary museum out east, I think still has a whole room dedicated to Amsel Kiefer. Everybody loves him. All right, now let's go to some of my favorites. Here we go, and this is going to be kind of a crazy list. Okay, Felix Gonzalez Torres, lover, died of AIDS, and so he decided to create a pile of candy that was equal to the weight of his lover when he died of AIDS, I believe, or maybe before he contracted AIDS. And you are invited to take the candies and eat them throughout the day when it's shown in a gallery. And then the curators, probably actually more like the guards, replenish the pile every night, so that it equals out again, and then people go back again and grab the candy. And Torres did die of AIDS himself. Very controversial. There was for the first time, the federal government had an LGBTQ gallery exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery. And Torres's film that had ants crawling over a Christian crucifix made a whole bunch of conservative congressmen mad. And the National Portrait Gallery pulled it out of the show, and the Walker and other contemporary art museums throughout the country in protest showed Torres's film constantly. As one of these unfortunate situations in which brighter voices didn't prevail with regards to censorship. Okay, and then here's Anne Hamilton. She's known for her really interesting installations, and I've seen her work a couple of times. I saw it last time in Seattle a couple of years ago. She did this really cool thing at the Armory in New York City recently, where people were invited to swing on these wooden swings, and textiles would go up and down with the swing, which was kind of fun. This is Mel Chin, and this is outside of Minneapolis, and he is definitely a conceptual artist. I love his stuff. And in this particular instance, he had plants that would uptake particles in the soil, contaminated particles in the soil, and then he would have the plants burned, and then the contaminated particles in the soil would come out. He has done a lot of different things, and look him up. He's amazing. I wish I could talk about him more, but we're already at 34 minutes here. Okay. Andrea Zittel is known for her living units, and this is out of her circumstances. She was very poor in New York City. She was an artist, And she could basically do everything out of this living unit. She has since, I was just talking to Jeremy about this, she has since moved her operation to the desert, and you can apply to be a part of her sort of experiment and live in someone similar to these living units, but they're a little bit bigger. And she's known for having, maybe I have it. Nope, sorry, that's Glenn. She's known for having worn one dress for a whole month, washing it out, of course. It wasn't that gross, but she knitted these dresses that she could take to one of her desk jobs. That's another part. She's on Art21, really fascinating person. Glenn Ligon, I would say, is one of the most famous African-American artists working today. And he takes text and uses stencils, obviously. The text is about African-American history and his life as an African-American. He's also gay, and sometimes that comes through with his writings. And it's coal dust that he's using on these works. And famously, when Michelle and Barack Obama came into the White House in 2008, they asked the Hirshhorn Museum if they could have one of Glenn Ligon's works, very similar to this one, in the White House, displayed instead of all that old master white artist stuff. So yeah, look him up. Glenn Ligon's great. Charles Ray is kind of a bad boy of art. He's definitely an artist of the 90s. And for the Whitney Biennial back in, 1993, he constructed a fake fire engine. He's also the one, and we've looked at it in class, who did the crumbled car at the Walker. That's Charles Ray. Coco Fusco and Guillermo Gomez Peya, at the Walker, in the sculpture garden of the Walker, but I don't think that's here. But anyways, they did it around the United States, and they presented themselves as indigenous Mexican people and had people take photographs with them as if they were, I guess you would say, in a natural history museum or kind of like a zoo, and it's a performance art piece. They have since split. I don't think they work together anymore, and Coco Fusco has been very influential with her writings. Yeah, so it's entitled The Year of the White Bear and Two Undiscovered Amerindians Visit the West. Now, when you talk about lately, let's just say the 90s through the aughts, figurative painter of note, it would definitely be John Curran. And he oftentimes uses his wife, who's also an artist, as his model. She's in the middle there, kind of. This is one of my favorites of his. This is Thanksgiving. Warning, he has lately, or at least last 5-6 years ago, gone into pornography, and I was like, why? I don't know why he thought he had to do that. But so look at his stuff from the 90s and the early aughts. Gabriel Orozco is a fascinating Latinx artist. He took this car and cut it down the middle and then joined it. And he's definitely a conceptual artist, very interesting. He's kind of not as much of he's not as popular on the art market as he used to be. There was a real sort of fascination with him a couple of years ago, and not so much anymore. Another figurative artist would be Elizabeth Peyton, known for painting her friends, kind of like skinny guys and skinny ties is kind of how I think of her, but someone still to pay attention to. Kara Walker is probably the most famous working female African-American artist today, known, of course, for her very disturbing silhouettes that looked at the physical and sexual domination of whites over blacks before and after the Civil War. And I think we've looked at her sculpture of the Aunt Jemima Sphinx And we've also looked at her newest work that's at the Tate, which was a fountain. So we've kind of already covered her a little bit. Mark Dion is one of my favorites. A couple years ago, it was my birthday, and I went to his talk at MIA, and he's a conceptual artist. In this case, he made this fake curator's office that he claimed to have found that was abandoned at Minneapolis Institute of Arts. And you can see it. You can't go inside it. It's like a period room. What he usually does is he's an artist in residence at a museum, and then he takes some of the stuff from the permanent collection and develops a discussion around sometimes science, sometimes curatorial practice, and creates these really interesting installations. So you can go see this one actually whenever MIA reopens. And then one of my favorite African-American artists and contemporary artists today is Layla Ali. I need an I on the end of that L on the slide list. She did this very famous series called the Greenhead series. She talks about on Art 21 how she was one of the only African-American girls in her elementary school in New York State, and she hated the game of dodgeball. And thinks it should be eliminated from all gyms across the United States. She's come back to the Greenhead series, but no longer makes them green, which is kind of interesting. Okay, and then last but not least on this, some of my favorites, it's Janine Antoni. She made a series of sculptures in chocolate and a series of sculptures of herself in soap. And she bathed with herself and then would eat parts of herself in as the sculptures. And she's there's a lot of stuff of hers that I find very, very interesting. Definitely some feminist ideas flowing through her work, and she's worthy of your attention. Okay, now we're going to go to England here you can see the series of soap and chocolate busts. Okay, glad I showed you that. Okay, and now we're going to move to the young British artists, the YBAs. They were huge in the 1990s. Of course, the most famous is Damien Hirst. He took a great white shark and put it in formaldehyde. Famously, the original shark was decomposing, so they put a new shark in there, and of course it brings up the question as to, is it the same work of art? Should it be worth the same amount of money? So Damien Hirst, definitely somebody you want to look at. Tracey Emin, this was a controversial work. So she took this tent, and then she put all the names of the people that she had slept with. She's very controversial. I like her stuff. I have no issues with Tracey Emin. She also did this piece on her bed, which was kind of a hearkening back to Rauschenberg's bed. So that's Tracey Emin. And then Chris O'Feely. So I was teaching one of my first couple of years at Perpich in the late 90s. And Chris O'Feely's The Holy Virgin Mary was in a show called The Sensation Show in New York City. And Mayor Rudy Giuliani was in an uproar because the Madonna painting had elephant dung at the bottom and kind of to the right of the Madonna's breast. And he was horrified, and he was going to close down the Brooklyn Museum of Art. And we should have known how horrible he would become later on down the road. Huge controversy. And what O'Feely said was, in his indigenous African, among his people, African dung is sacred. And so that's why he had it in the Madonna and Child work. And it all kind of blew over, and the Brooklyn Museum of Art didn't lose its funding from New York City, But boy, Giuliani just made himself out to be an absolute, I won't say what I'd like to say, horrible person. And then I think we've seen Ginny Seville's work before. Very famous for her paintings of Rubenesque women from different points of view. And she's doing some great work as of late. Make sure you look her up as well. Now, Grayson Perry, to me, is just this very interesting artist. So I guess you would call it drag. He does drag. He's heterosexual. He's married and has a daughter. And actually, I have this great postcard of him and his wife and his daughter. Kind of a famous photograph by some other people. And I just love his stuff. He does ceramics, as you can see in the upper left hand side, but then he also does these textile works, more sort of I guess to the bottom right, and then he does these paintings, and I just really really like Grayson Perry's work. He's really a huge celebrity in England, and someone to sort of enjoy and embrace. Jeff Koons, the guy, the sculptor, the artist that the Viz kids love to hate. So Koons, of course, one of the things that people have against him is that, much like the minimalists, he doesn't actually make the works. He has a studio of artistic fabricators, and then he employs over 110 studio assistants to do his paintings and his sculptures. And this is Balloon Dog. Love him, hate him. It's up to you. I'm not a huge fan, but his works, of course, go for over $100 million. And yeah, okay, there you go. And then, interesting to me at least, Michael Kimmelman, who was the lead art critic for the New York Times in the 90s, said that Matthew Barney was the most important artist of the 90s. And I don't think anybody believes that anymore. He's kind of gone off the radar, Matthew Barney, but he created this series of films called the Craymaster films. And they included in them this sort of satyr figure, and it's him, actually, in makeup. He was obsessed with Vaseline, and so he's tunneling his way through Vaseline. And what he does is he would make these Craymaster films, and he would sell them to contemporary art museums for a lot of money to finance his next Craymaster film. And so you can't go to Netflix and get his Craymaster series. I have a little bit of a compilation DVD of his works, but if you want to see his stuff, you have to see them screened in major art museums, and the Walker has them all. They really love Matthew Barney. Yeah, so supposedly the greatest artist of the 1990s, but not so much anymore. Okay, then I wanted to go to some Asian American artists. This is Ian Chen's work, and I think this is a still from one of his videos. I think that's right. I've gotten to know him just a little bit as of late. This is now, hey, we're moving into 2015, 2017, so I wouldn't call that the early aughts. And then this one is one of my favorites. This is Miwa Yanagi's Yuka from the Grandmother series. I am just love her stuff, her photo. I think she's primarily a photographer. And then maybe the most important middle age, sort of mid-career African-American artist would be Mark Bradford. And he's one of these guys, unlike Cindy Sherman, that really became known in his late 40s. He's a super tall, thin guy. and gay, and he does this performance art piece where he's in a hoop skirt trying to play basketball, and he worked in his mom's beauty salon, and he always said the reasons why he escaped AIDS was that he'd make his money and then he would be in Europe for the summer, and then he'd come back and work in his mom's shop. And that's seen in some of his early paintings. He uses foils from her shop and pastes them onto his paintings. And this is something that I was lucky enough to see this work, and it's huge. This is just part of it, you guys. The Hirshhorn Museum is the contemporary museum on the Mall in Washington, D.C., and it's a round museum, much like the Guggenheim in New York. And this is called Pickett's Charge. And it is all around the top floor of this museum. And there is a layering that's involved, and then a cutting away of those layers, and it's just really, really beautiful work. And Bradford now is supporting other artists in Los Angeles. I don't know if I said he was from LA, and is this real force in contemporary art. Hold on, guys, I gotta take a break. Okay, I'm back. Sorry about that. Bryn had to tell me what the dinner plan was. Let's move away from Mark Bradford and go to somebody that we've talked about a lot before. We don't really know talked about her all that much more. This is Amy Sherald's, of course, painting of First Lady Michelle Obama. I was lucky enough to see it this summer. It's awesome. It's touring the United States. I'm hopeful that I can see it during the holidays in LA, because I'm lucky enough to go to Southern California during the holidays. And then this is one of her later works. This is actually 2018. Did we talk? I think we talked about this one in class. I don't think it's sisters. I think it's a lesbian couple. But yeah, Amy Sherald is somebody that's so beloved now on the art market. And then I have actually postcard, and I also have a magnet of this one. I've always liked it. Miss Everything. This is 2014, and then this is another one that I like. And I'm just showing you ones I like. I don't know why. It's just am. Okay, guys. The answer to the question of the day is Avery has been reading the science fiction classic Dune. Dune is what he's been reading in preparation for the movie that's coming out in December that hopefully we will see together. Okay, now let's go to some Latinx artists. This is Raul de Neves. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. And he made a name for himself in the Whitney Biennial 2017. Very colorful, celebratory, aesthetic, just an amazing artist. Look him up, see some of his videos online. He was who everybody was talking about in 2017 and has gone on to have some solo shows as well. Okay, and then here is the installation at the Whitney, actually, guys. So he created the designs for the stained glass window, and then the really interesting fashion costumes. I don't know what you would call them. I think probably fashion. All right, now let's go to some Native American artists. The male Native American artist that everybody's talking about is definitely Jeffrey Gibson. And what he's known for on the right are these punching bags. There's actually one in the collection of Mia that I might have shown you guys at some point. And some of his text has to do with his life as a gay American Indian. And then on the left, you'd have to believe it has maybe something to do with his indigenous culture, but maybe he's playing off of it, I would suspect. I saw a show of his in Milwaukee. I have a catalog of his show. He's somebody definitely to pay attention to. And then we've got Wendy Red Star. If you've been doing your homework, you're familiar with her works. I listened to a podcast recently. She was talking about how in graduate school, getting her MFA, she didn't make that much work. but she was assembling things that she could put into something like this photograph. And guys, this is a little bit of an inheritance from Cindy Sherman way back in the late 70s, early 80s, doing staged photography. But obviously, it's different because Wendy Red Star is making a commentary about how whites look at indigenous culture. And then these are really interesting. I don't know if you guys saw these on the homework. I think you did. But she takes these historical paintings and appropriates them and then adds text to them, which I find really interesting. And then here she is with her daughter. And also in that podcast, she talks about now that she has become so well known and everybody wants her to speak at their museums and such, that she's trying to, control the balance between life and work and such. It'll be really interesting to see, and we will witness it, what she does in the next couple of years. And then back to figurative painting for my last part before. This is not going to be an hour. It's going to be less than an hour. So this is Nicole Eisenman, and this is one of her more famous works. She's playing with a little bit of Bosch, Blind Leading the Blind, or is it Bruegel? What am I saying? It's not Bosch, it's Bruegel, sorry. Blind Leading the Blind down below. And then the interesting man with his buttocks frontal. Yeah, and lots of people just love her, think she's one of the most dominant figurative artists today. I have on here the two most talked about painters of the day. And then Dana Schutz would be the other one. And of course, she became notorious or famous, whichever way you want to say it, for doing a painting of Emmett Till in his coffin. And there was a huge uproar in Boston when it went on display. And a lot of African Americans thought that she didn't have the right to paint something like that, a African American boy in his coffin. That's there's a very famous photograph from the Civil Rights era, and I think she paid dearly for that with that controversy. She strikes me as a very sensitive, aware person. She probably shouldn't have exhibited the painting. I will admit to that. But it's interesting. She just had a show at the end of last year, and a lot of people have been talking about how did that controversy impact her newest series of works. And so look up her newest works and that controversy. And nobody was monolithic in their discussion of it. There were some African-American artists who thought it was fine that she was using that as her subject. She has promised to never sell the painting and never show it again. So there you go. And then this is one of her newer ones, 2018 Mountain Group. And you can see both in Eiserman's work and Schutz's work, they're really playing, of course, with anatomy and maybe grotesque, and so on and so forth. All right, we did it under an hour, 58:26. That is art of the 80s, 90s, and aughts, and a little bit of the 70s. Take care.